Hi, this is Paul. Dr. James Orr, who I've watched quite a bit now on the Jordan Peterson Exodus seminar, was on trigonometry. And it was great. It's a great video. I was very impressed by his answers, how he handled the situation. I didn't really know him until Peterson sort of brought him up onto the Exodus seminar, but I was very much taken by this video. Now, I'm not going to walk through the whole video, but I do want to play a part of it because he gets at some of his ideas, which Benjamin Boyce and Wolkel distance we're talking about in terms of, okay, but the you have the progressives and the conservatives. Now, progressives always want to be progressing. The conservatives always want to be conserving. Those aren't two great sort of buckets to hold everything into because, of course, once the progressives hit a certain point, they usually want to conserve what they've progressed towards instead of having yet another cadre come and want to progress beyond that. So he talked a lot about that which is pre-political, that which is before politics, and Constantine sort of pushes him on this here, and he lays out a few good ideas that I wanted to bring in.
But I want to come back to a couple of the things you said, James, because you used a word that I've heard used before, but the way you used it lit a bunch of light bulbs. I mean, you talked about pre-political, and I think that therein lies the answer to all of this, which is we have to have something that we all agree on, basically. Now, let's put God to one side because we don't all agree about that. It's just a fact, whether you'd like that or to be different or I'd like that, whatever.
Now, that sort of brings up Constantine's conversation with Jordan Peterson. So put God to the side. Okay, we could have a long conversation about what on earth we mean by God, but fair enough. And we'll keep going.
What do we have left that is pre-politically agreed on in our society? Because for some time I thought that maybe it's, Western values or British values, but you walk up to the random person on the street, ask them what British values are, they're going to run away from you, right? So what do we have left that is pre-political?
Well, I would say increasingly little, or at least the sort of engines that drove our kind of that produced the glue that stitched us together in a way that transcended the sort of mechanisms of state and law and so on, are under attack. And I think this is basically because there's been a shift to thinking of all pre-political domains as intrinsically political. And
like family, sorry to interrupt, but this is such a good example because for me, a new father, the idea that having a family and children, blah, 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 it's like a self-evident truth that is something a society is inevitably built around. And if you...
Now what's very interesting, so he's just had a kid. Louise Perry talks about the fact that having a child really transformed her perspective on human sexuality, politics, liberty. Mary Harrington said the same thing. I think perhaps a big part of what's going on in terms of our politics is the increasing number of people who have themselves not had children, because having children definitely changes you. It especially changes the woman because she usually is the one who, whether or not the man is faithful, is there with the child. And there's a tremendous amount of biological bonding that goes on. They carry this child for 9 months until the child actually comes. The man might feel the child move around in the belly, but it usually takes a little bit longer for the father to begin to bond with the child. But yes, and you very quickly realize that your family is in many ways pre-political. Politics of the state, whatever, that bond to that child is a very deep and profound thing.
You observe a society, you can't deny that that's not true. But there are people to whom the very notion of even advocating for the idea of family being central to society is a political statement that they find abhorrent because
and one of the big battlegrounds is going to continue to be, it is in America with respect to schools, abortion, trans, parents' rights, all of these issues. Basically, some of the arguments are, well, the state has a greater claim on your child than you do. And well, once the state begins to take that over, the state had better begin to produce children, because people will stop, because there's nothing more gut-wrenching than to have the state take your child.
It excludes the moonlit uplanders, right?
Absolutely right. So there can be there is no kind of non-political dimension to human life. And this is something which, again, I think is, it's a broadly religious idea. This is a thesis not about the state, not about public policy, but about the way the world is. And so there's nothing within the world that escapes the system of oppression, the system of kind of our sort of structural captivity. And, now at one level, it's not wrong. I mean, Aristotle has a famous line in politics that man is a politikon zoon, is a political animal, right? By which he means he's an animal that belongs to the polis. That is, an animal that is not designed to exist alone. Like we're all.
I watched Mueller with a video on ContraPoints, and I was thinking about maybe doing a video about that on gender identity. And he sort of walked through from his own philosophical perspective all the ideas of gender identity. And what really struck me was the utility of the agent-arena relationship. A lot of what we're dealing with over the last number of years, Patrick Deneen just put out a piece on Unheard about John Stuart Mills, who basically makes the same point that James Orr makes earlier in this video with respect to liberalism has this inherent progressive liberationist ethos to it. And part of what we're seeing is the natural working out of liberalism. Then the question is, okay, can we get beyond liberalism? Many have noted that liberalism itself seems to rely on, liberalism is, again, sort of like a church. It's like a secular church, and it seems to rely on this foundation beneath it. It wants to sort of modulate that foundation, but it's dependent upon this foundation that is beyond it.
We are a political animal, right? By which he means he's an animal that belongs to the polis. That is, an animal that is not designed to exist alone. Like we are to that extent all political. We're all part of a moral community, but we've got to negotiate our participation in that in all sorts of different ways. But yes, that's right. I mean, I think you've now got a situation where there can be no pre-political, everything, even configurations of family, the understanding of family life. Faith is now seen as freighted with ideologically problematic assumptions, or often faith is seen as an opportunity to sort of drive a kind of truck right through the established conventions that the faith historically had built up. So it's a real struggle, and I think probably one of the reasons that conservatives tend to do so badly in a lot of these struggles is that politics isn't everything. Politics is not something that you're going to do at the weekends. Whereas I see on the other side there is a kind of actually sometimes morally remarkable investment in the political. So it just dominates every aspect of as.
This is a point David Brooks makes often, that part of what's become unhealthy is that politics has grown too large. It should be, earlier in the video, they talked about faith, family, and flag, that order is extremely important. Faith should come first. Faith is the kind of thing that should permeate all of life, and faith should have an appropriate touch on all of life. Faith is the kind of thing that affords baseball, and affords weekends, and affords national parks, and affords life outside of the political, and in fact affords life outside the familial. Jesus himself says, unless you hate father and mother, basically Jesus essentially says faith, family, flag. It should come in that order. Because if you have first things first, then suddenly everything can be afforded. If you put something in before something in too quickly, something that is misshapen or is too large, you wind up with distortions. Another video I want to make today is on Kierkegaard. Some really good video with Andrew Sweeney and John Vervaeke and Christopher Mastropietro on Kierkegaard and Christianity was, I thought, a really good conversation. And it highlighted for me a book that I had read, a biography of Kierkegaard that I'd read a number of years ago that I want to bring into the conversation, because Kierkegaard is quite helpful in this, because part of what Kierkegaard is wrestling with is, in fact, the place of Christendom and the church with respect to state. And of course, liberalism grows up in sort of the declining. Part of me thinks that in many ways the end of Christendom is the Protestant Reformation is the end of Christendom. There's a significant dislocation once you have territories that no longer are under the throne of Peter, let's say.
That those activists' lives, that it's that important, and there can be no weekends in the struggle to liberate ourselves from tyranny. And
but
so
James, you haven't run off
and again, then it's totalizing.
And joined a convent or jumped off a cliff or whatever, from which I deduce that you do believe something can be done about this.
Yes,
because you're still doing stuff in the world.
I'm still doing stuff, and and loving it, and I'm happy and free, and I'm doing work that I love with people I love spending time with. I think I'm fortunate. I'm in a remarkable university that has been through some spasms and here and there. But broadly speaking, when you look across the landscape, certainly of higher education across the West, certainly over the other side of the Atlantic, a place like Cambridge is still very much a place where you can speak freely. Not many people maybe share the views that I share, but and there can be some resistance to it sometimes. But broadly speaking, it's a function, more than a functioning institution, and it's an institution in which one can live an intellectually and professionally flourishing life. But yeah, I mean, there is, I think they're broad. Sometimes I think that, people who are, pessimistic about the consequences of this revolution sometimes think you're sort of in like a little bit like you're in the 1520s, just sort of right after the Reformation. You broadly had three strands. You had the sort of...
This is what I really wanted. This I thought was really tremendous. Tom Holland again and again talks about sort of the 1960s being like the 1520s. And what he's about to lay out here, I thought, is a really good sort of approach to this.
Lutherans, or early Lutherans anyway, sort of in like a little bit like you're in the 1520s, just sort of right after the Reformation. You broadly had three strands. You had the sort of Lutherans, or early Lutherans anyway, who thought, well, we can reform this. The institution is bad, but we can reform it from within. Just give us a bit more time, bit of diplomacy, bit of organizing. We'll regain the university. We'll regain this institution.
Now, you got to hold these labels a little bit loosely, because of course Luther was this titanic figure that sort of remaps everything. But this Lutheran position, as you go to a Lutheran church, you can still kind of smell Rome in it.
And then I think there's a more radical strand that says, nah, it's over. Mm-hmm. We're done here. We need to build parallel institutions. I think you're seeing this in the United States. You're seeing sort of to some degree, a kind of sorting mechanism, a sorting pattern in the sort of into the red states and the blue states. And that's the kind of Calvinist option. We need a Geneva. We're fed up with Rome. We need Geneva. We'll start again. And I sometimes think there's a third strand. And I think of these as what I call the digital Anabaptists. So the Anabaptists said, now the problem...
That's really clever.
Is institutions, full stop. And we need networks, and we need to operate, and we can only flourish and operate outside the institutions. And I actually see what you guys are doing to sort of fall into that third strand. You've got enormous influence and reach, and you're engaged in a lot of these discussions and battles, but in a completely non-institutional mode. And that's actually can be very, very effective, particularly in this new digital public square, which opens up all sorts of interesting kind of opportunities and dynamics. So I'm in the first camp because I think in Cambridge, that all is.
And again, I think that the Lutherans, the Calvinists, and the digital Anabaptists, I think that's a tremendously helpful sort of taxonomy to frame all of this. And of course, in this little corner, we've talked a lot about structure and institutions, and Jacob and his organization was sort of playing with ideas. We've had Estuary, which has its own structure, very loose, much more of a network.
All is not lost by sorts of interesting kind of opportunities and dynamics. So I'm in the first camp because I think in Cambridge, that all is not lost by any means, and I think the same is true of Oxford. If I were in some other universities in this country, and certainly if I were at many universities in the United States, I think I probably would say Barry Weiss and Neil Ferguson are spot on. We need to start something new. Or my friend Stephen Blackwood, who started Ralston College, or we need separate institutions. I just got back from Hillsdale College. It was hosted by the great Larry Arn, the president of Hillsdale College. Just a small classical liberal arts.
Now again, notice that I don't know if that connection was made by the Exodus seminar, if it happened before, or exactly who brokered it. It's very interesting. Another thing to notice here is that often when I'm listening to people in the UK, and I noted this when I was in the UK last summer, how often people talk like, well, the United States is so fragmented in this. And part of me thinks, is the United States really that fragmented more than Europe? I can't really tell. So it's interesting to watch the two groups look at each other, because there's often a perception in the United States that Europe is more progressive, more radical, more divided. And then when they're basically saying the same thing about the States, it's kind of like, that's interesting. I think part of it, though, in terms of sort of the Calvinist separate institutions, new institution, I think part of it is also that the United States is just more entrepreneurial. Americans tend to start new things and go with new things. And I think there's often the sense that that's a deeply Protestant thing, where you have the Church of England, and Americans sort of inherit in some ways some of the fringes and then turn around to recolonize the UK with what's going on here. And they actually talk about that a little bit later. We'll see how soon it comes in, or if I have to kind of dip into a little bit ahead of the time to find it.
Christian college, but it's a remarkable place, and just sticking to. And
it's so funny because he's talking about Little Hillsdale College in Michigan, which, from the perspective of a lot of people at Calvin, well, those are those kind of, this is this tiny little radical separatist thing, but via these networks. You've got the president of Hillsdale that's participating in the Exodus seminar. We're not going to see the president of Calvin University or Wheaton participating in Peterson's Exodus seminar. So you very much have the sense of networks and fringes.
The Western canon is pretty ecumenical, not denominational, and is doing fantastic work. And then and I admire and support people who want to build a new Genevas, and admire and support those who are operating outside the institutions in what you might call networks. I mean, this is Neil's square and the tower distinction, which I find very helpful. I mean, a lot of people are thinking, the idea is that, the tower is the way we tend to look at history, big institutions, popes, kings, great men, etc. Whereas, in fact, a lot of the drivers of historical change and cultural change, economic change, are operating in the square down below, in the marketplace, through networks that are largely invisible to the naked eye of the historian. They're just harder to see. You can trace the history of an institution much more easily than you can trace the the development of a sort of network of friends and patterns of correspondence and so on and so forth. But I think
And I think that harder to see is a really important point. Again, part of what we're really wrestling with right now is, I've done a lot of thinking lately about agent-arena relationships. The agent-arena relationships are always in sort of this transjective reality where you're always sort of negotiating with your perception of the arena in order to have agency within it. And a big part of what we see happening is, in fact, that increasingly our arenic perceptions are mediated by these screens and these voices and these institutions. And the point that networks are much harder to see, yet are deeply impactive of the arena and deeply impactive of our perception of the arena, I think is really quite vital.
Increasingly, the good that is to come, I do believe is around the corner, will be those sort of networks in the square, as it were, or perhaps networks that end up in the tower. And there's a huge advantage to networks, I think, and they're much more flexible. They can adapt much more rapidly to changing circumstances. Networks accommodate disagreement very well. If you sort of a couple of people fall out, or two important people in a fall out, that can be a disaster for an institution. An institution splits, there's schisms and so on and so forth. In a network, you just sort of rearrange the nodes a bit, maybe cut a couple off, but it's very, very sort of adaptable. It changes. The trouble is, institutions have this legacy that can go way beyond the lifetimes of its members, whereas networks are much more dependent on its people
and the relationships between the people,
on the people who make it up, which is not a bad thing. It's the good thing about networks is that they're easier to trust. I think it's more likely that the British Museum is going to go woke. Probably has gone woke.
No,
already.
it is very woke. I was there a couple of months ago and I was staggered by what I saw.
Right. So more likely for the British Museum to go, very likely the British Museum guys go woke than you, Francis, will go woke. That is to say, people are much harder to capture in that way, whereas institutions remarkably are. And we've seen this with astonishing speed. And that puts conservatives in a funny, paradoxical situation, because the instinct is to conserve. But why would we want to conserve capture? We don't like burning things down. But what happens when maybe, you do need to go off and do something else? You need to just say, look, this has got to the point where, this is an institution that is hostile to me and hostile to all the values I hold dear, and I think hostile to the founding vision of the people who set it up and have been stewarding it over time. But I'm not going to spend my...
And that brings again back to the pre-political, the things that are larger than politics, that navigate and orient and help, in fact, politics points to. Anyway, that was the heart of what I wanted to bring out, sort of the Lutherans, Calvinists, and Anabaptists, the networks versus the tower. I thought those are really helpful insights. The whole video is good. Watch the whole video. I thought it was a really tremendous conversation. James Orr does most of the talking in this, and he's really got a lot of terrific ideas. Very good to listen to and very recommended.